Today's recording comes from Chapter 3 of our textbook, and I'm going to be starting right at the very beginning. And from looking at the title, we're going to be thinking about stakeholders and just the different people that have a stake in what a company does, some of whom are part of the company, work for the company, own the company, run in the company. Others might be people who provide services or supplies to that company that are themselves part of some different organization, customers, etc. There can be a wide variety of folks who have a stake in what a company does. So let's think a little bit about that today. So I'm starting right at the beginning of Chapter 3. In May 2018, in the wake of a global uproar after two black men in a Philadelphia Starbucks were arrested while awaiting a friend, Starbucks closed its approximately 8,000 U.S. stores to conduct racial bias training. The company also officially changed its policy to allow people to visit its stores and restrooms without making a purchase. Hoping to avoid more incidents like this one, sparked by a white employee calling 911 when the men did not buy anything, the two men who were arrested eventually settled with Starbucks for an undisclosed sum. I'm going to pause and take a look at the figure here. Looks like the figure is just the sort of the picture at the top of the page, but we also notice this text here. Starbucks, based in Seattle, Washington, is a company with more than 250,000 employees and locations across the globe. It directly affects countless stakeholders beyond its institutional investors and millions of customers, from coffee growers and milk producers to urban and suburban communities and developers to local, state, and national governments. Okay, so we're getting a sense already in this first paragraph that there's just so many people who are affected by what a company does. Starbucks seems to have responsibilities and causal influence effects on quite a number of people, even people that don't directly work for Starbucks. So as we continue, as one of the largest beverage retailers in the world, Starbucks directly affects countless stakeholders: food and drink distributors, coffee and tea growers, milk producers, urban and suburban communities, local, state, and national governments, more than 300,000 employees and 1,600 institutional investors, and millions of customers. The company's decision to close its U.S. stores for half a day was financially costly, and the training session could never fully solve the problem of conscious or unconscious bias, but the firm believed it was the right thing to do. Why does it matter to its stakeholders what Starbucks does? What role do stakeholders play in a company's decisions about its ethical behavior, and why? Okay, one thing I'm noticing is that there's a difference, and this says more than 300,000 employees. Up here it said more than 250,000 employees. I guess those could both be true, but it's interesting that the numbers are different. Either way, though, the number of employees at Starbucks is very high, so a lot of people are affected, even by closing their various locations for just half a day in this case. Okay, so in the next section, by the end of this section, you'll be able to identify key types of business stakeholder relationships, explain why laws do not dictate every ethical responsibility a company may owe key stakeholders. Okay, so there's going to be some kind of distinction between what's strictly legally required of a company versus maybe what we might morally owe them. We might morally owe them even more than what the law requires of us. And that seems like a plausible distinction to me. And then we'll also discuss why stakeholders' welfare must be at the heart of ethical business decisions. Okay. Have you ever had a stake in a decision someone else was making? Depending on your relationship with that person and your level of interest in the decision, you may have tried to ensure that the choice made was in your best interests. Understanding your somewhat analogous role as a stakeholder in businesses, large and small, local and global, will help you realize the value of prioritizing stakeholders in your own professional life and business decisions. Stakeholder relationships. Many individuals and groups inside and outside a business have an interest in the way it brings products or services to market to turn a profit. These stakeholders include customers, clients, employees, shareholders, communities, the environment, the government, and the media, traditional and social, among others. All stakeholders should be considered essential to a business, but not all have equal priority. Different groups of stakeholders carry different weights with decision makers in companies and assert varying levels of interest and influence. As we examine their roles, consider how an organization benefits by working with its stakeholders and how it may benefit from encouraging stakeholders to work together to promote their mutual interests. Okay, so again, we're thinking about the different sorts of people and how you prioritize the different people. So think about the Starbucks company. Remember, it mentioned 300,000 employees, 1,600 investors. This is an interesting one to think about. Suppose you have a high-level investor, someone who invests a lot, maybe financially invests a lot in your company. And then imagine just one of your 300,000 employees. Suppose they're both going to have a stake in whether or not you shut down the business. Suppose your one employee really needs to work, really needs the work that day, and so if you shut down the business and that person doesn't get paid, that employee might struggle to pay rent that week or purchase groceries or something like that. Suppose that's the sort of thing that's going on. But you have this one investor who's very interested in sort of the social reputation of your company. And imagine that investor is going to stop investing in your company if you don't take your employees through some kind of racial bias training. And so now what Starbucks has is a kind of choice, right? Where you've got the investor and you've got the employee. And probably it wouldn't be just one employee that would need the money from working, but you would have more than that. The question is, suppose it's just one employee that really needs the money and then one investor that really wants you to shut down the stores that day. Whose interest gets prioritized? Do you prioritize your employees over your investors or your investor over your employees? How do you make that decision? Is it just based on downstream consequences for the company? If you lose this important investor, maybe that might really cost your business a great deal. Whereas if you lose this one employee, you'll probably replace them pretty quickly, right? Because people probably are applying to work at Starbucks all the time. Yet at the same time, we also think of the employee maybe as like the employee is like the little man, the one that we want to defend, sort of like the weaker person in this case versus the big powerful investor or something like that. So you might think maybe we should prioritize employees over investors, something like that. But we know that all employees are affected by what the investors do, right? And all the investors are affected by what the employees do. So there's just really interesting tension, really difficult tension. For Starbucks with a decision like this, and any company with a decision like this. Now, suppose maybe you think in this case the important investor should be prioritized more highly than the individual employee. But like I said, probably more than one employee really needs the money, right? So I don't know. Suppose you have 50,000 of your employees, 100,000 of your employees. I don't know who really need that money from working, and how many of the employees do you have to add together before they begin to outweigh one investor or two investors or something like that. So those are, again, different questions about how to prioritize these relationships. Where was I? I think we're here. What are the roles of an organization's many stakeholders? We begin with the internal stakeholders. The board of directors, in a company large enough to have one, is responsible for defining and evaluating the ongoing mission of a business after its founding. It broadly oversees decisions about the mission and direction of the business, the products or services offered, the markets in which the business will operate, and salary and benefits for the senior officers of the organization. The board also sets goals for income and profitability. Its most important function is to select and hire the chief executive officer, or president. The CEO is usually the only employee who reports directly to the board of directors. He or she is charged with implementing the policies the board sets and consulting with them on significant issues pertaining to the company, such as a dramatic shift in products or services offered or discussions to acquire or be acquired by another firm. In turn, the CEO hires, we're going to shift to the CEO. So about the board of directors, first and foremost, you notice that all of those things that the board of directors is interested in seem very different from the things that some individual employee, like a barista at a Starbucks location, are going to be interested in, right? So the kinds of choices, the kinds of decisions that the board of directors are making just are worlds apart from the kinds of decisions that some particular employee at a particular location are going to have, right? And the reasons, for being there are very different. The stakes are very different for each of them too, right? So it's interesting thinking about, read this paragraph carefully and think about how different this is from what a particular barista might be interested in at a Starbucks location. It seems very different, right? And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, right? You need both the barista and the board of directors in a company this large. But we have to realize their interests are potentially very different. So in turn, the CEO hires executives to lead initiatives and carry out procedures in the various functional areas of the business, such as finance, sales, and marketing, public relations, manufacturing, quality control, human resources, sometimes called human capital, accounting, and legal compliance. Employees in these areas are internal stakeholders in the success of both their division and the larger corporation. Some interact with the outside environment in which the business operates and serve as contact points for external stakeholders, such as media and government as well. Okay, so now we're getting a hint of a different kind of internal stakeholder. Again, I mentioned like a particular barista. That would be an internal stakeholder as well, right? We might call that like a low-level employee compared to the CEO, who's like the high-level employee, right? But again, even the CEO's interests are going to be slightly different from the board of directors' interests. CEO is going to be in charge of, hiring, financial officers and, lawyers and those sorts of things. All that's going to kind of funnel back to the CEO, be on the CEO's shoulders. And so when you have the CEO, she might, again, have very different interests and responsibilities than even the board of directors above her or the baristas below her. Right? And so we're getting a sense of that here. And then we're going to shift here to external stakeholders for a business. In terms of external stakeholders for a business, customers certainly are an essential group. They need to be able to trust that products and services are backed by the integrity of the company. They also provide reviews, positive or negative, and referrals. Customers' perceptions of the business matter too. Those who learn that a business is not treating employees fairly, for instance, may reconsider their loyalty or even boycott the business to try to influence change in the organization. Stakeholder relationships, good and bad, can have compound effects, particularly when social media can spread word of unethical behavior quickly and widely. Okay, so now think about customers who are upset with the business model just being implemented at some particular business. So suppose you've got a longtime Starbucks customer who is upset with the way that these two men were treated back in the first paragraph that we read. Now, as a customer, you have a stake in the business, right? And you have a view that matters. The business owners, that CEO, that board of directors, they care about what their customers think, right? So there's interesting questions when we as customers think about how we can exert our influence on a business. In this case, you might think, wow, these two men were badly mistreated by the Starbucks organization, and it traces back directly to this policy that they have about whether you have to purchase something in order to use the bathrooms or come into the store or something like that. And so as a customer, you might be upset, right? And you might want the corporation to change. So you might begin boycotting. You might be telling your friends to boycott Starbucks. You might be raising a fuss online, right? Trying to draw attention to this issue. It could be, the stories can be reported in the news and the media, right? To put pressure on the organization to change their policies, change the way that they're treating people, so that incidents like this don't continue to happen. And so you can sort of campaign for the sort of moral benefit of the company in that sense. But again, be aware of the fact that your consequences, or your actions rather, have consequences, right? And so if you boycott a company, you're not just harming that CEO and that board of directors, right? You're also harming that barista at that particular location, right? And that's if Starbucks begins to fail, that means the first people that are going to start suffering, the first people to get laid off are going to be lower level employees, right? That CEO is, not likely to get laid off right away, or if she does, she's going to find another job somewhere pretty quickly, I would think. But it's those sort of lower level employees that are really going to feel the consequences of that. So again, even as customers, we have to think about the effects of our actions and who are our actions really affecting the most. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that you would never boycott. It just means that you have to prioritize the different stakeholders. You have to think about who's being affected, and you have to make a decision that takes all of them into account. And sometimes maybe that means we've got to boycott, and sometimes maybe it means we shouldn't boycott because the problem isn't serious enough to warrant that sort of a response, something like that. Okay, so now you can see some of the thoughts I have as I'm going through the reading from this week. As you continue reading, keep thinking about these sorts of things. Make connections as you go from one paragraph to the next. Talk through it. Think about examples in your head, and I think it'll help you as you move through the reading.